We're now going to read the story that comes in the Gospel, but it's an interactive reading today, and every now and again Katrina will pause in the story and we're all going to say, now the instructions are that you are to say this with a surprised or incredulous tone. That's right. And as the story unfolds, you'll see why you're asking these questions. I will hold this up at the appropriate time.
Jesus was teaching in the temple when the chief priests and elders of the people approached him. Once more, Jesus told a parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away. One to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, maltreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'"
It's always nice to have encouragement from people. Our worthy worship leader this morning in the vestry said to me, "It doesn't have to be perfect, you know." That was a really helpful comment. It was. I'm serious. We try our best to make everything work, but sometimes it doesn't. And so that was a good word. I want to refer to a couple of verses from our Gospel. The story that Katrina read beautifully, as usual. The new look, Katrina, and you look lovely. And we responded to with questions. What? There were so many things going on. And I would have to say right at the outset, the 8:15 congregation, after proclaiming the word and coming to my conclusion, which is, you're all welcome to God's party, and it just wouldn't be the same without you. And somebody then said, "Well, what about that guy that got thrown out because he didn't have the proper wedding suit on?" I said, "Oh, that's part two." I just didn't deal with that. It is difficult. That part of the passage seems to imply that if you're not up to scratch, God's not interested. And I reject that outright, of course, because the rest of the story says God is so interested that all are invited, all are welcome in this house. We've just sung it. So the two verses I want to refer to are the first, which is a response to those who were critical of Jesus. They were out to get Jesus. There's no doubt the closing passages of the Gospels show that quite clearly. And so Jesus said, "To what shall I compare the kingdom of heaven? It is like a king who was preparing a marriage feast for his son." And the next verse I want to refer to is where the servants are latterly sent out to get people from the high street, the byways, everywhere they could, to bring in the good and the bad alike. So I want to frame this understanding of the text on those two verses. And when I was reflecting on these verses, what came to mind was something that happened to me a long time ago. Now, you know what happens when you get a bit old. You kind of forget things that you did yesterday or last week. Did we go to the play on Wednesday? Yeah, I think we did. But 50 years ago, clear as a bell, I was an apprentice printer, a letterpress machinist. A man slightly older than me, Richard Young, was a bookbinder, and we became friends. Richard was a 10-pound pom. Okay, you all understand that language. He had migrated, and where was he living? You were one? He was living at Jepp's Cross in the Nissen huts, where the migrants were settled. And he got married, and I was invited to the wedding. Now, I had my eyes opened, because all of these English people, whose at that time I probably couldn't quite get the accents. I've now learned to understand people from north of London. I love language, I do. I love Steve, I love John, you know, the accents are beautiful. But then I was a young apprentice, and I didn't quite know what was going on. But what I discovered was that they were drinking and dancing and having a jolly good time. I had led a very sheltered life. I remember my father pointing out, we lived on a main road, which was not that far from the old Hilton Hotel, not the one in the city, but South Road, Sir Donald Bradman Drive, that one. And people would come home, men coming home from work would have stopped there. They probably knocked off at 4:30 or something or other, would stop there with 6 o'clock closing. They would fill up their kit bag with bottles of beer, balance it on the handlebars, which were upturned handlebars, and be coming past our house like this. And my father would point out to me the evils of drink. I lived a very sheltered life. My 21st birthday party, no alcohol whatsoever. I've got a picture of myself in a suit and tie, and everybody was dressed appropriately. Growing up in the church, we had none of that sinful dancing. We did have social gatherings, and a man came down from the Blackwood Church to our church to teach us folk dancing, where, of course, you were some distance from your partner. But then we'd have games in which you would pass the orange, or the balloon between your knees or something like that. I mean, you all respond to that. Yeah, because we were growing up to be good young persons. And this really was an eye-opener to me, that these were still good people, but they were enjoying themselves with beer and with dancing and singing. Became quite raucous. Now with television and documentaries, we see all kinds of celebrations at those special community functions like weddings or birthdays, particular birthdays where communities are brought together to enjoy that mark of that person's life or those people. Okay, you've got the picture. Sitting in church, we may not think very much about how often the Gospels tell us about Jesus enjoying parties. Flick through, particularly the Gospel according to Luke, and look at the number of times Jesus either was in attendance or talked about parties. He often referred to the kingdom as a feast. Take Luke, for example. What happened to the lady who lost the one coin from the 10 that was across her forehead, which was the kind of the symbol of a married person? She lost one. She searched the house diligently with a lamp because they had dirt floors and straw and it was very difficult to find it. And when she found it, what did she do? She rejoiced greatly and called her friends and neighbours together to celebrate. That which was lost is found. Or the lost sheep. 1 out of 100, when you find it, on the shoulders, calling the friends and neighbours together to rejoice, I have found the sheep that was lost. Another party. And of course, the famous one, the son who went off and enjoyed himself, quote, in riotous living. He's probably at Richard Young's party, wedding. But he comes home, what does the father do? The fatted calf, the older brother didn't even kill a chook that had stopped laying for me. I mean, the emphasis on the rejoicing and the community coming together to celebrate is what it's all about. And this parable is told, I suspect, quite pointedly. Now, we don't know. We don't know what Jesus' motivation was. Whether somebody in the crowd said, hey, you keep talking about the kingdom, what do you mean? Or we read that the religious leaders, or as John Henson puts it, the religious clique, they were present when Jesus told this story. It's a story. It's not history. It's a story. And the story shows that this king who gets everything ready and calls the invited guests, it's now ready. You know how it happened, don't you? It was to happen. People were told it's going to happen. But the when and the where, it's not like now where you get a note that says RSVP, please respond if you will. But that's not young people, is it? You just kind of, better offer comes along, well, you don't bother, isn't that right? Well, it seems to be with the friends our son's got, you just go out at 9 o'clock at night or something. When we were growing up, that's when we had to come home. Well, not quite, but, here is this feast that's about to take place. The people have been invited. They send the servants around to say, come along, it's ready now. Now is the time. Come. And they didn't bother. They had other better things or more important things they thought to do. So the king, what does he do? My house will be filled. That is the motivation according to the story. He wants that celebration to happen. And so everybody's invited in the community. The riff-raff, the good, the ne'er-do-wells. And if somebody said, now, what is the meaning of this? Somebody might say, it's blindingly obvious. Jesus' ego is in the way. These gospel stories are telling us quite clearly the opposition Jesus was getting. He had become enemy number one. And so there's a reaction to him. So the ones that he thought maybe would follow and listen and respond to his teaching had refused. So we find there is a dozen people who respond. And look at their CVs. Fishers, they can't do much on the Sabbath. They're on the altar. Tax collector. You go through. These are the ones whom Jesus got. So you can see why somebody might say it's Jesus' ego, that he hasn't got the people he really wanted, so he's got the riffraff, the residue, the good and the bad. Well, it's worth putting that in parenthesis and think about it at a later time. But go back to the story. What really is at the basis of this story? All are welcome. All are welcome in this place. As we come to this ancient liturgy of Holy Communion, ancient in the sense of the practical things that we do, but not ancient in the language we use, as we come to this, remember this gracious invitation. Come to the party. It just wouldn't be right if you weren't there.